In the burning lands of North Africa during the 4th century after Christ, when the deserts of Egypt had begun to fill with hermits and monks, there lived a man whose name would one day be spoken with reverence, yet whose beginnings were marked by violence, rebellion, and blood. This man would later become known as Moses the Black, a towering figure among the Desert Fathers, remembered for the terrifying darkness from which he rose. Before he became a saint, before he wore the garments of humility, and before his voice carried wisdom, he was known for something entirely different. He was known as a criminal, a bandit, a man feared across the countryside. Historical traditions describe Moses as a man of great physical strength, towering in height, fierce in temperament, and quick to anger. His early life unfolded far from monasteries. Moses was born south of Egypt, most likely in the lands of Ethiopia or Nubia. These regions were known for powerful warriors and rugged landscapes, where survival required endurance and strength from an early age. In the later 4th century, Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, yet large regions of Africa remained shaped by tribal traditions and local conflicts. From his youth, Moses displayed remarkable physical strength, but these gifts would eventually carry him down a path of lawlessness and destruction. And it would begin with slavery. Moses was at one point enslaved by a government official or wealthy household within Egypt. Many servants lived under strict discipline, yet Moses proved to be unlike most others. He was rebellious, uncontrollable, dangerous. Accounts describe Moses as possessing a violent temper, often responding to commands with defiance and aggression. He was known to steal. He was known to strike others. He was known to threaten those around him. Over time, his master, fearing both theft and violence, made a decision that would change the course of Moses' life forever. He expelled him. Thrown out from the household, Moses entered the world alone, with strength in his body, but chaos in his heart. And without discipline, strength becomes a weapon. Moses did not seek honest labor. Instead, he joined a band of criminals. At first, he served among them as one of many, yet his strength and ruthless nature quickly elevated him. Soon, Moses became their leader. His gang operated across remote regions, targeting travelers and robbing caravans that passed through the desert roads linking Egypt. But robbery alone did not define his reputation. Violence did. He became known not merely as a thief, but as a man capable of murder. Stories spread of a massive man whose anger burned like desert fire, whose strikes were merciless, and whose presence left destruction. Among the many stories, one incident stands out with clarity, remembered as a turning point in his journey. It was the incident of revenge, and it would bring Moses face to face with the limits of his own power. Among the many crimes attributed to Moses during his years as a bandit leader, one story has survived through centuries with striking detail. It is preserved by early monastic traditions as both a historical account and a symbolic turning point in his life. It began with theft. On one occasion, after carrying out a robbery, Moses discovered that a shepherd had interfered with his plans. This interference prevented him from securing what he believed rightfully his through violence and intimidation. For a man already hardened by anger and pride, this was not merely an inconvenience, it was an insult. And Moses did not forgive insults. Consumed by rage, he swore revenge against the shepherd, determined to punish the man who had dared resist him. The shepherd lived across a stretch of marshland fed by branches of the great Nile River, an area difficult to cross when waters rose. Yet, Difficulty did not deter Moses. Driven by fury, he set out alone to find the shepherd, carrying with him weapons and certainty. As he approached the marsh, he discovered that the waters had risen higher than expected, transforming the landscape into a barrier of deep channels. Most men would have turned back. Most men would have waited. Moses did neither. Instead, he removed his clothing, placed his sword upon his head to keep it dry, and plunged into the waters. He swam across the flooded terrain with relentless determination, his muscles cutting through the current while his mind burned with violent purpose. The journey was dangerous, but his strength prevailed. At last he reached the far shore, but when he arrived at the shepherd's dwelling, the man had already fled, warned by villagers who knew of Moses' reputation. Denied his revenge, Moses' anger did not fade. It intensified. Unable to find the shepherd, he turned his rage toward property instead, setting fire to nearby structures and seizing livestock. This story reveals the depth of Moses' fury, the uncontrollable nature of his anger, and the terrifying power he wielded without restraint. Yet beneath this rage, the seeds of transformation had already begun forming, though neither Moses nor those around him yet recognized it. No man escapes forever from the consequences of his actions, and the path of violence eventually leads to isolation. As Moses' reputation spread across the settlements of Egypt, his name became synonymous with terror. Travelers whispered warnings about him. Villagers barred their doors when rumors placed his gang nearby. Caravans altered their routes to avoid territories under his watch. Fear followed him like a shadow. Yet fear carries a hidden cost: isolation. Historical reflections emphasize that Moses lived in constant tension, surrounded not by loyalty but by mutual distrust. Violence breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds loneliness. While Moses possessed physical strength, he lacked peace. His nights were restless. His days were filled with pursuit and evasion. Authorities sought him. Enemies watched him. His violent reputation ensured that no place could ever truly become home. It was only a matter of time before he was forced into hiding, and when that moment came, it would lead him to a place he had never intended to enter, a place of silence and prayer. The turning point did not begin with repentance. It began with necessity. Moses became the target of intensified pursuit. Seeking refuge, he traveled deeper into the desert regions of Egypt, known for harsh landscapes and the communities of monks. These monks, the Desert Fathers, had withdrawn from cities to live lives of solitude and prayer, forming settlements like Scetis. At this time, Moses did not seek holiness. He sought safety. He needed somewhere to hide where pursuers might hesitate to follow. Guided by desperation rather than faith, Moses approached the boundaries, unaware his violent life was finally beginning to unravel. When Moses first arrived among the monks, he came as a fugitive. The monastery offered him shelter because they extended mercy to all. To them, every soul carried the possibility of repentance, even the most hardened criminal. Moses initially remained as an outsider, uncertain, watchful, and resistant to their quiet way of life. He had lived among weapons and shouting. Now he found himself surrounded by silence. He had known nights of robbery and pursuit. Now he witnessed nights of prayer and humility. The contrast unsettled him. Though he had entered seeking protection, he found himself confronted by something unfamiliar: peace. Not forced peace, but disciplined peace born from prayer and surrender. At first, Moses did not embrace this life, but he did not leave either. Something held him there, something deeper than fear. Within the quiet rhythm of monastic life, the first cracks began forming in his soul. Life within the monastic settlement did not resemble anything Moses had known before. There were no shouted commands, no drunken laughter, no sudden violence. Instead, there was order, steady, disciplined, unwavering order that governed every hour of the day and night. The monks of the desert followed strict routines shaped by prayer, labor, fasting, and silence. These patterns of life were designed not merely to occupy time, but to transform the human soul through repetition, patience, and humility. For a man like Moses, whose strength had been forged in chaos, this new environment felt foreign and suffocating. He was accustomed to taking what he wanted. Here, he was required to obey. He was accustomed to dominating others. Here, he was expected to serve. Historical accounts describe how newcomers were given demanding tasks as training, a way to discipline the body while teaching the mind to submit. Moses, whose body possessed extraordinary strength, was assigned heavy labor. He carried water across long desert distances. He hauled supplies. He worked under the burning sun while others prayed in silence. These tasks tested him not physically, but emotionally, challenging his pride and forcing him into submission to authority. At times, anger rose within him. At times, frustration boiled beneath the surface. Yet he remained, not because he had suddenly become holy, but because he had nowhere else to go. And sometimes transformation begins not with faith, but with necessity. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, something unexpected began to unfold within Moses. Silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of hiding, but the silence that emerges when noise fades and memory begins to speak. For the first time in his life, Moses was no longer constantly running, fighting, or planning the next act of violence. He had time to think, and with thought came memory. Repentance begins when a man confronts his past without distraction, allowing the weight of memory to settle upon his conscience. For Moses, this process was painful. Images of his past rose before him: burned villages, stolen property, wounded victims. At night, while the monastery slept, Moses often remained awake, wrestling with enemies within: guilt, anger, pride, and shame. For a man who had never feared another human being, these inner struggles proved more terrifying than any physical threat, because physical enemies can be defeated, but the conscience cannot be silenced so easily. Despite his inner turmoil, Moses did not abandon the monastery. Something deeper began forming, the first fragile spark of repentance. Repentance was not a single moment of regret, but a lifelong turning, a gradual redirection of the heart toward peace. He listened to the prayers of the monks. He observed their patience. He watched how they treated one another with humility and compassion. This unfamiliar world slowly reshaped his thinking. He began to imitate their actions. Historical traditions suggest that during this early stage, Moses did not yet possess spiritual strength, but he possessed persistence. He remained when others might have fled. He endured when anger urged rebellion. He listened when pride demanded independence. And through this persistence, the first foundations of transformation were laid. The violent bandit who had once terrified villages now stood among monks, a man standing at the threshold of change, a man whose greatest battles had not yet begun. because while the desert had silenced his weapons, it had not yet silenced his passions. In the years to come, those passions would rise again with terrifying force. The war within his soul was only beginning. As the days of Moses' early monastic life stretched into weeks and months, he realized that the desert was not devoid of trials. In the solitude of such barren places, the human soul is laid bare before the weight of its own desires, passions, and unresolved sins. The bustling world offered distractions to obscure the conscience, but the desert demanded confrontation. Moses now faced the storm of his own inner passions. Each memory of wrongdoing rose like waves against his will, whispering for the old familiar satisfaction found in domination and indulgence. By night, when the wind swept across the rocky plains, the fires within the monastery flickered, and Moses wrestled with thoughts never acknowledged. His body, though disciplined in carrying water and hauling wood, seemed to betray him in the stillness, reminding him of pleasures long forsaken. Monks understood that temptation was a persistent trial. Moses began to seek counsel from the elders, who had already emerged tempered by their discipline. The elders recognized his extraordinary potential. They understood that salvation is forged in the crucible of struggle, especially for a man of violence. They encouraged him to remain steadfast in prayer, teaching him that the greatest battle is against the unbridled impulses that reside within himself. Moses transformed his nightly torment into growth, approaching temptations with deliberate confrontation, staying awake in the darkness while reciting prayers. He observed the rising and falling of his desires like waves passing beneath a ship, anchored firmly to virtue and humility. In the deserts of Scetis, labor was essential to spiritual development. Physical exertion was designed to humble the body and weaken pride. He carried water across long stretches of sun-scorched desert, each action a meditation meant to erode the arrogance that had once defined him. The physical burden was matched by internal weight. In learning to endure tasks without complaint, he began to translate endurance into spiritual resilience. Every drop of sweat was an emblem of transformation, reflecting the strength required to command his own soul rather than wielding power over others. Monks observed his transformation with care. They saw that a man capable of great evil could become a vessel of extraordinary virtue. As months turned into years, Moses' nights became the stage for the greatest battles of his soul, magnifying every thought and fear. Monastic tradition records that he would spend entire nights in prayer, his heart directed toward God, transforming shame into spiritual insight. Through these night vigils, he developed a rhythm of vigilance, observing the movements of his mind as a soldier observes the battlefield. He discovered that the most effective conquest is over the turbulence within, requiring a discipline far exceeding the physical strength of his past. Among the many struggles faced by Moses during his early years in the desert, none proved more persistent or exhausting than the battle of the flesh. These desires returned again and again with relentless force, refusing to yield to mere effort or determination, demanding instead a deeper surrender of pride. Though Moses had abandoned his life of crime, the inward remnants of his former habits continued to surface in thoughts and memories. These rose unexpectedly during the quiet hours of solitude, reminding him that conversion of life requires long and painful purification. The elders of the desert taught that temptation of the flesh was among the most powerful adversaries faced by monks who once lived without restraint. Moses found himself confronting desires that felt as real and overwhelming as the enemies he once faced with sword in hand. During the stillness of night, Moses often experienced waves of temptation so intense that sleep became impossible, forcing him to rise. He walked beneath the vast canopy of stars, whispering prayers with trembling lips while pleading for strength to resist the darkness. He approached his spiritual elders in moments of desperation, confessing openly the intensity of his struggles rather than hiding behind pride. The man who once commanded fear through violence now stood humbled before teachers, acknowledging his vulnerability and requesting discipline. The elders responded not with condemnation, but with instruction, urging him to increase his labor and extend his hours of prayer. They taught him that the flesh, when disciplined through effort and sacrifice, gradually loses its authority over the soul. This battle did not end quickly. Moses discovered that spiritual strength required patience far greater than any physical endurance. The elders provided counsel shaped by experience, understanding that a man with Moses' past required guidance both firm and compassionate. One lesson involved relentless manual labor combined with constant prayer, intended to redirect the restless energy of his body into purposeful activity. He was instructed to carry water from distant wells repeatedly, walking long distances beneath the burning sun while reciting prayers. The weight of the water symbolized the burden of his past sins, while the rhythm of his footsteps became a meditation. Through these practices, Moses began to internalize the wisdom of the desert, learning that victory is rarely dramatic or sudden. The elders also emphasized confession, believing that secrecy strengthens temptation, while honesty weakens its hold on the heart. Moses learned to confront his weaknesses without fear, transforming shame into determination and failure into opportunity for growth. Among his trials, one episode stands out as a defining moment of humiliation that produced genuine humility and reshaped his character. Moses discovered that items like bread and supplies were mysteriously disappearing, stirring echoes of his former life as a bandit. Determined to catch the thief, Moses stayed awake through the night, watching in silence as shadows moved across the desert floor. When he identified the individuals responsible, he discovered they were not strangers, but fellow monks testing his patience and restraint. Instead of reacting with violence, Moses chose a different response, accepting the humiliation without protest. The greatest victories are often invisible, measured by the quiet mastery of emotion and the willingness to endure loss without anger. Among the disciplines assigned to Moses during his years of struggle, none became more symbolic of his transformation than the repeated task of carrying water. This labor demanded not only physical strength, but endurance of mind and humility of spirit, gradually reshaping his understanding of power and service. The desert of Scetis, known for its dryness, required monks to walk considerable distances to retrieve water from distant wells, a necessity for spiritual discipline. For Moses, who once used strength to terrify others, carrying water became a daily reminder that true strength lies in sustaining life and serving others. As he walked beneath the burning sun, he learned to direct his thoughts toward prayer, allowing each step to become an offering of repentance. Moses often volunteered to carry water for other monks as well, willingly accepting additional burdens as a means of disciplining his body and will. This practice gradually weakened the hold of pride, replacing anger with patience until the man who destroyed villages began sustaining communities. Although labor strengthened him, his greatest enemy remained the fierce anger that had once defined his identity and elevated him among bandits. The Desert Fathers instructed Moses to confront this passion directly, transforming it into patience through repeated acts of endurance and restraint. He faced situations designed to provoke irritation, learning that anger is defeated through conscious redirection of emotion toward forgiveness and understanding. During moments of mockery or criticism, Moses resisted the impulse to react, choosing instead to remain silent and reflect upon his past. As his control strengthened, observers recognized a remarkable transformation, witnessing a man capable of extraordinary restraint, replacing his former violent character. Over time, his violent reputation faded, replaced by admiration for his humility, and the monks began to regard him with profound respect. As years passed, Moses emerged as a fully committed monk, whose dedication inspired those around him. Moving from novice to seasoned ascetic, Moses eventually gained recognition for his wisdom, offering counsel to younger monks who struggled with temptations similar to those he had once endured. His experiences became lessons for others, his failures transformed into guidance, and his victories into encouragement for those fearing their past sins. The transformation of Moses marked the true beginning of his legacy, revealing the extraordinary capacity of the human soul to change. As the years passed within the disciplined silence of the desert, the transformation of Moses did not remain hidden. The consistent pattern of humility, obedience, and endurance that defined his daily life gradually reshaped his inner character and how others perceived him. He turned from a once feared bandit into a figure of quiet strength, whose presence inspired respect rather than fear. The monks of Scetis, who had initially observed him with caution, began to recognize the depth of his repentance through his actions. In the desert, words alone carried little weight, while perseverance over time revealed the sincerity of a man's commitment. The life of the Desert Fathers was built upon long observation, patience, and discernment. The elders did not grant trust quickly, knowing that spiritual maturity required years of disciplined effort rather than sudden enthusiasm. Moses distinguished himself through unwavering consistency, accepting the most difficult tasks without complaint and rising before dawn for prayer. He maintained vigilance over his thoughts even during periods of exhaustion, his transformation marked by countless small victories accumulated over time. Historical traditions recount that Moses eventually became known among the monks as a man of unusual patience and deep humility. These qualities were particularly remarkable given the violence of his past, demonstrating that the most hardened character could be reshaped. Younger monks, struggling with their own temptations, began to seek his counsel, recognizing his insights into conquering powerful passions. Moses did not assume authority willingly, nor did he seek recognition, for he had learned to distrust pride and self-importance. He understood that spiritual leadership is measured by the capacity to serve others with humility and compassion. Yet the elders, observing his growth, began to entrust him with greater responsibilities, allowing him to mentor novices and oversee tasks. This gradual elevation did not distance him from manual labor, but rather deepened his commitment to service rather than dominance. The authority of a spiritual guide must be rooted in personal example rather than command, as Moses demonstrated through his daily actions. Repentance was not merely an inward emotion, but an outward transformation visible in the smallest details of his life. As his reputation spread, travelers and visiting monks began to speak of him with admiration, recounting the story of the former bandit. His life became a living testimony to the power of repentance, reaching distant settlements and inspiring those who heard it. No person, regardless of past sins, was beyond the reach of redemption. Yet even as respect increased, he remained aware of his former life, using the memory of his past as a source of vigilance. He reminded himself that humility must be preserved through constant effort, and that spiritual growth could be lost if pride took root. Leaders of the monastic community began to consider entrusting him with responsibilities beyond the duties of ordinary monks. In the early Christian tradition, the decision to ordain a monk to the priesthood was never taken lightly. The role demanded a proven record of humility, discipline, and moral integrity, qualities Moses had demonstrated through years of service. Moses was eventually presented before a bishop who had traveled to Scetis to evaluate candidates for ordination. When Moses stood before the assembly, his presence alone carried the weight of his past and the transformation that followed. The bishop sought to test Moses' humility through criticism, a method used to reveal whether pride remained hidden. He deliberately spoke harshly of Moses, referring to him as unworthy and unfit for priesthood due to his past crimes. Rather than responding with anger, Moses remained silent, accepting the criticism without protest. He acknowledged the truth within the bishop's words, recognizing that his past actions could never be erased from memory. This response astonished those present, revealing the depth of his humility and a transformation deeply rooted in self-awareness. Satisfied that Moses possessed the necessary humility, the bishop proceeded with the ordination. This marked a significant turning point, establishing him as a priest within the monastic community, a role of both honor and responsibility. This moment did not elevate Moses above others, but rather bound him more closely to the discipline of service, reinforcing that priesthood was a commitment to guide others through the challenges of repentance and spiritual growth. Among the many stories preserved in the oral and written traditions of the Desert Fathers, one of the most profound centers on Moses the Black. It is an account of a symbolic act designed to reveal the true nature of repentance and the subtle danger of judging others. This event reflects the spiritual depth Moses attained after years of disciplined life, showing why he was regarded as a teacher of humility. In the monastery of Scetis, certain brothers began to question whether Moses, given his violent past, should be entrusted with authority. They struggled to reconcile his former identity as a feared bandit with his present life of discipline, service, and humility. The elders of the monastery, possessing wisdom and pastoral sensitivity, devised a subtle test to reveal the spiritual condition of the community. They prepared a basket filled with sand, woven intentionally so that its contents would slowly escape as it was carried. They instructed Moses to carry this basket through the monastery courtyard while they gathered to observe his response. As Moses obeyed without question, lifting the basket upon his shoulders, sand began to leak continuously from its structure. He walked steadily across the courtyard, leaving a trail behind him, the contents of the vessel diminishing until it was nearly empty. The monks watched in silence, expecting him to react with confusion, yet Moses continued his task with calm and deliberate movements. When the task was completed, the elders asked him to explain what he had experienced during the exercise. Moses responded with profound humility, stating that the basket represented his soul, and the escaping sand symbolized his past sins. He explained that his sins, though forgiven, remained visible to others and could not be entirely concealed. He taught that the only appropriate response to such imperfection is humility rather than pride, and patience rather than anger. This response revealed the depth of his internal transformation, for he no longer viewed his past as something to hide. The lesson of the leaking basket became a lasting symbol, teaching that imperfections are not obstacles, but reminders of the need for grace. Moses' role shifted significantly. He transitioned from a monk undergoing transformation into a recognized spiritual father. Younger monks sought his counsel, drawn by the authenticity of a life reflecting discipline, compassion, and lived experience. His guidance emphasized that failure, when met with repentance, becomes an essential part of the journey toward holiness. Through these teachings, Moses became an embodiment of the desert tradition, that no human life is beyond redemption. His presence remains a living testimony to the transformative power of humility, discipline, and divine grace. As the reputation of Moses grew within the monastic communities of the Egyptian desert, his influence began to extend beyond the boundaries of his own monastery, reaching other settlements where monks lived in isolation, prayer, and continuous struggle against temptation. For in the world of the Desert Fathers, spiritual authority was not granted by position alone, but recognized through the consistency of life, the depth of humility, and the clarity of wisdom demonstrated through action rather than proclamation. Moses, whose transformation had unfolded gradually through years of discipline and inner struggle, now embodied these qualities in a way that made him a living example of the teachings he once struggled to understand. Historical traditions preserved among the sayings of the Desert Fathers describe Moses as a man whose counsel was sought in moments of confusion, conflict, and temptation, not because he claimed superiority over others, but because his life itself testified to the possibility of change, making his words carry weight that came not from authority, but from authenticity. Monks who visited him would often find him engaged in labor, prayer, or silent reflection. Yet when he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and deeply rooted in lived experience, reflecting an understanding of human weakness that could only come from one who had himself endured its deepest forms. Though the desert tradition is cautious in attributing miracles, many accounts speak of events perceived as signs of spiritual insight rather than supernatural spectacle, moments in which his understanding of hidden struggles within others seemed to reveal an awareness beyond ordinary perception. These accounts emphasize not extraordinary displays of power, but rather moments of discernment where Moses could identify the inner condition of those who approached him, guiding them toward repentance, not through accusation, but through gentle awareness of their own hearts, a quality that the Desert Fathers regarded as a sign of deep spiritual maturity. His authority within the community thus did not emerge through institutional elevation alone, but through the recognition that his life had become aligned with the principles of humility, patience, and service, making him a reliable guide for those navigating the difficult path of ascetic life. Even monks from distant regions traveled to seek his counsel, drawn by the reputation of a man who had transformed himself so completely that his past no longer defined him, yet continued to serve as the foundation of his wisdom. In the later years of his life, Moses assumed a role that extended far beyond the boundaries of personal transformation, becoming a stabilizing presence within the monastic community whose guidance shaped the formation of younger monks and reinforced the spiritual discipline of those already committed to the ascetic path. His teachings, though not preserved as formal writings, survived through oral transmission, carefully recorded by those who heard him speak and observed his actions, forming part of the broader tradition known as the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, a body of wisdom that emphasized experiential knowledge over theoretical instruction. Moses consistently emphasized that spiritual life is a continuous struggle rather than a fixed achievement, teaching that humility must be maintained through vigilance, and that even those who have attained significant growth must remain aware of the subtle return of pride, anger, and desire. He often reminded his listeners that the memory of past sins should not lead to despair, but should instead cultivate compassion toward others who struggle, since awareness of one's own weakness fosters understanding rather than judgment. Monastic tradition also records that Moses was deeply committed to reconciliation and peace within the community, often intervening in disputes among monks with calm reasoning rather than force, encouraging dialogue and reminding them that division undermines the very foundation of the ascetic life. His presence became a stabilizing force within Scetis, not through authority imposed from above, but through the quiet influence of lived example, which gradually shaped the behavior of those around him. As his years advanced, Moses increasingly embodied the ideals of the desert tradition, living not for recognition or honor, but for service, prayer, and the guidance of others, fully integrating the lessons of his earlier struggles into a life defined by balance, humility, and spiritual awareness. Yet even as Moses reached the height of spiritual maturity and recognition within the monastic community, the desert tradition reminds us that no life dedicated to transformation is free from final trials. For the culmination of a spiritual journey is often marked not by comfort, but by the testing of all that has been learned, as if the soul must once more pass through fire in order to reveal the purity it has attained. In the final period of Moses' life, external circumstances began to shift as tensions increased within the region and threats emerged that would challenge the fragile peace maintained by the monastic communities scattered across the desert. Though Moses himself remained focused on prayer, teaching, and service, there was a growing awareness among the monks that a decisive moment was approaching, one that would require not only personal discipline but collective courage, and in which the principles of nonviolence, humility, and faith would be tested in their most extreme form. The desert, which had once served as a place of refuge and transformation for Moses, now seemed to stand on the threshold of crisis, setting the stage for the final chapter of his life, where his teachings would be embodied not through words, but through action. The elders of Scetis, recognizing the gravity of the situation, began to prepare spiritually for what lay ahead. And Moses, whose entire life had been shaped by the journey from violence to peace, stood at the center of this unfolding moment, fully aware that the path of the desert does not end in comfort, but in surrender, where the soul is ultimately tested beyond all previous limits. As the desert community of Scetis continued its rhythm of prayer, labor, and silence, a fragile peace began to break. The political and social tensions of the Nile region eventually reached even the most remote settlements, bringing the threat of violence. A group of armed raiders, described as violent and destructive, began advancing toward the monastery, threatening the lives of those dedicated to prayer. Fear began to spread as reports of danger reached the community. Many had long abandoned any form of violent resistance as part of their commitment. In this crisis, the community turned toward its elders, seeking direction. It was here that the full depth of Moses' transformation was revealed. Once a man who led raids and instilled fear, Moses now stood among monks who looked to him for spiritual clarity, not warfare. Rather than advocating resistance, Moses spoke with calm conviction, reminding them that their calling was founded upon peace and humility. He warned that to abandon these principles in fear would mean surrendering the very essence of their spiritual journey. As the confrontation approached, the monks gathered in anxious silence, torn between the instinct for survival and the teachings of non-violence. Moses reminded them that the true measure of faith is revealed in danger, where commitment to peace is tested against the fear of death. Moses ultimately chose not to flee, but to remain within the monastery alongside those who chose to stay, accepting the consequences. This decision was rooted in the understanding that the path of spiritual transformation cannot be abandoned when it is most severely tested. When the raiders finally entered, the ideals of non-violence and faith were confronted by the raw presence of destruction. Moses met the approaching violence not with resistance, but with stillness, embodying the radical commitment he had embraced for years. The legacy of Moses endured long after, serving as a powerful example of repentance and transformation within the desert tradition. His journey illustrated that no human being is beyond the reach of change, and that any past can be transformed through faith. His teachings carried weight because they emerged from a life fully transformed through struggle, offering a model of persistence and humility. Saint Moses the Black remains a testament to the power of redemption, emphasizing endurance over despair for all future generations.